I cannot expect you who read this at your fireside to appreciate my feelings at the time. The sound of the growling and the expectation of an attack terrified me at the same time as it gave me hope. If the tigress lost her temper sufficiently to launch an attack, it would not only give me an opportunity of accomplishing the object for which I had come, but it would enable me to get even with her for all the pain and suffering she had caused. Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today, I am going to be discussing this book, No Beast So Fierce by Dane Hucklebridge. This is an interesting book. The tagline says the terrifying true story of the Champawat tiger, the deadliest animal in history. That subtitle should be corrected somewhat because, and this is my biggest gripe with this book, there's a lot of assumption and supposition. It's almost like half fiction, like historical fiction in a way. So a lot of it is research into the area and the cultural context of it, the colonial context of this story, but a lot of it's also conjecture and assumptions on how people might have thought or acted towards the Champawat tiger. So I would really edit it to say the terrifying, mostly true story of the Champawat tiger, the deadliest single non-human animal in recorded history. There's a bit of an assumption about that because if Nepali numbers are to be mostly believed, and this is an estimate given by colonial authorities at the time and from what they had heard from the government of Nepal, and the Indian numbers are correct, this man-eating tigress ate 436, or at the very least killed 436 humans in a span of like 7 or 8 years. There's a point in this book where they discuss the average expected like weight a tiger would eat every week. Basically that within a 7-day period of time, tigers will eat about 150 pounds of meat. And given how many weeks there are in a year, say there's 52, multiply that by 8, and what you get is a number very close to that 436 value. I think it's 52 times 8 is 416, which is pretty close to the 426 number given by current estimates of this tiger. This individual tiger started its rampage in Nepal and eventually moved to India due to hunting. A group gathered to hunt that particular tigress. When it crossed the border, it didn't travel far, and then it killed 236 Indians within a span of another 4 years. So this is a very prolific man-eater. And, okay, the second chapter discusses what the author believes led to this man-eating tiger's rampage. And that is given due to research and estimations by witnesses to the Champawat tiger's reign of terror. And what is clear is that the Champawat tiger, at some point during its youth, perhaps when it had young that it was taking care of, its rider fangs, both the upper and lower canines, were destroyed. And two things that would do to an animal. One, it would have open nerve endings, which would make it an incredibly painful injury. Maybe those nerve endings would dull eventually or be less painful. It would get used to that pain. But it would also make the tiger unable to use its jaws to capture meat, prey, the way it was evolved to do. Its claws, its a swipe, a swat with its paws is still really powerful, but that's not as efficient as the biting structure of big cats. And I've discussed this ages ago, I think, with a mountain lion discussion, but mountain lions, jaguars, lions, tigers, most felines have these large canines, to upper to lower, that seem designed to sever vertebrae. That they get in there, their preferred prey, get to the nape of the neck, and just separate nerves, separate spines, vertebrae from the rest of the body, thus paralyzing, or if not outright paralyzing, suffocating the animal. So I think, like with mountain lions, the assumed or believed most common method of attack is pouncing on the back of the neck, which would separate vertebrae. But with jaguars, the most commonly seen method of attacking seems to be like getting the trachea and then just gripping that, which suffocates the animal. With tigers, either one, though probably the trachea because of the angle of its attack, it's not leaping onto enemies, onto its prey from behind. It is usually going after things like deer that are taller than it. So, you know, either one, it's getting in there and it's choking. But if you don't have part of those tools to choke as effectively or sever spines as effectively, if it doesn't have the sharp, if it doesn't have the conical tip of a fang, of a canine tooth, then how is it going to puncture the skin as easily? So this tigress had to adapt its hunting methods to what it could do. And this book, though it discusses a lot of that, kind of like I discussed it a couple of years ago, The Tiger by John Vaillant. That story is more about why that tiger was like the conditions in eastern Siberia that led to that tiger eventually killing a hunter and eventually attacking the party that went out to kill it. And I opened that video with a description of its roar as it attacked those men. That incident was for, I think, at most 5 or 6 people that had been eaten. I think it was actually just the one hunter, but it had evidence of having been injured in the past and probably having eaten people. I'd have to double check that book, but that tiger was significantly less prolific, like hundreds of times less a man eater than this tigress, the Champawat tiger. And part of that is because of how remote, eastern Siberia is, how low population that region is compared to Nepal and India. The Indian subcontinent has a huge population center, even in rural areas. But this book also tries to discuss the colonial context of tiger hunting and the pre-colonial context of tiger hunting, where in Nepal and in most of the Indian subcontinent, tigers weren't man eaters. If they were exceptions to the norm, that out of maybe 100,000 or more tigers, like a single digit number of tigers per year were man eaters. And that of hundreds of millions of people at the time, I think it says like the turn of the 1800s into the 1900s, the population of India is about the same was about the same as the current population of the United States of America. So a much bigger population over a much smaller area of land. And so a man eater is not going to be as common per capita in that kind of region. Even in America, there aren't really many stories of man-eating bears or pumas or wolves. But when a predator does consume a human or kill a human, it's a big story and there's a big hunt to get it. In this case, the tiger was very rural. The lines of communication were difficult, were sparse. And so these villagers were putting up with this man eater for years, I think 4 or 5 years before it was killed. And it was um, only in the last couple years that the British Empire really knew or was publicly admitting how many humans this tigress was eating. But it also goes into the colonial context of how, tigers were property of the kings and the emperors of the Indian subcontinent, Nepal, India, Bengal, that these were creatures that were only hunted by kings to show their authority over the forest, that tigers were considered the rulers of the forest in the same way that we consider lions the king of the jungle. These tigers were kings of the forest ecosystems. They were almost divine in some ways. So to kill one was to establish one's right to the entire region. Tigers were rarely killed, and when they usually were done in very specific procedures that benefited the locals that could help hunt those tigers, that it benefited, these huge parties of people. It was not something that was taken lightly. But when the British came to the Indian subcontinent, Europeans, especially the British, have a very different mindset towards hunters and predators. That by the time they started colonizing the Indian subcontinent, wolves had been exterminated from the British Isles. Bears had been exterminated for hundreds, I think 1,000 years. Hunting cats had also been eliminated hundreds, maybe even 1,000 years before. So the British Isles was a region with very few hunters and with a prevailing mindset of kill every predator that you find. So the nobles and the rich British colonialists took to hunting tigers in great numbers because it was their divine duty to eliminate predators from places that could be used for profit, for conversion, for whatever reason. If a tiger was there preying upon animals that could be hunted by British people, if they were there eating people, preventing expansion and deforestation and settling of new lands, it was something that deserved to be killed. So this book sets out to make the case that the Champawat tiger and the man-eaters afterwards, leopards and tigers, were a case of a man-made disaster, something where the behaviors of colonials and of locals over a century of colonialism created this environment where tigers had a much smaller suitable habitat, where a lot of their normal prey were being killed due to disease or overhunting by the ruling class, and where there was a population explosion because of the expansion of agriculture at that time, where the tiger was less, where the victims and the villages in those the victims in those villages were less likely to be able to use the traditional methods of hunting tigers because due to a colonial rebellion, Indians were disarmed of weapons, and so the spears and guns and swords used previously to hunt tigers were not available to the common people. How, you know, inexperienced tiger hunters could create injured tigers that would become man-eaters. And, all of these contextual reasons, it's a really good narrative, and I liked it. But it also felt, the conjecture wasn't really true in the sense that the subtitle implies it is. There's only a handful of quotes from James Corbett, who was the hunter that killed the Champawat tiger. And to be honest, his involvement in this narrative is only in the tail end of it. But even so, for a book that focuses on his hunt of it and the tiger overall, having I can count on both hands the number of direct quotes from Corbett. So it is an interesting narrative, but a lot of it is conjecture. A lot of it is assumptions on how the tiger would have felt, of how the people involved would have felt, about repetition, a lot of repetition about emphasis on the colonialism. It just repeats a lot of passages. And I mean a lot of passages. There are probably more than I can count on two hands. Individual passages that are repeated later on in either that chapter or the next chapter. All told, it's like 20 or 30 times that happens. So it felt like padding, and I was relieved when I checked Goodreads afterwards that reviews of this book when it first came out also leaned heavily on that issue with it. So I paid $8 for this at Coas back in 2022, and I appreciated this book. It was a nice book. I really loved the narration at times, but it was distracting, that repetition. It was distracting that there were so few primary sources referenced, that it was good at describing how this tiger, this tigress, was dangerous, but I think it did a lackluster job in other ways. I still think the $8 was well spent, and I think if you were to find this on the shelves, it would be worth picking up. Just go into it with certain expectations. It's not entirely true. At times it's historical fiction. So yeah, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.